used here includes just. Taking a simple example today, reapportionment on the basis of one man, one vote is based on the opinion that one man, one vote alone is just. Now, despite that prima facie evidence of political philosophy has become incredible, implausible today. And this is due in the first place to the view now prevailing that the only kind of genuine knowledge is scientific knowledge. This view is called positivism. Positivism was founded by Auguste Comte. I spoke last time of his central teaching, the law of the three stages, theological, metaphysical, and positive or scientific. The positive stage is the highest and the final stage in the development of the human mind. One cannot understand the scientific spirit if one does not understand the fundamental and typical obstacles to it. And these obstacles are precisely the theological and the metaphysical spirit. Kant, in contradistinction to present-day positivism, still holds the view that common sense knowledge is genuine knowledge, so that scientific knowledge is only universalized common sense knowledge. And Kant still calls the scientific study of social phenomena what he was the first to call sociology or social physics. He still calls that political philosophy. Now, sociology in Kant's sense depends on the sciences preceding it. In the first place, biology, then chemistry, physics, and ultimately mathematics. Yet, sociology does not depend completely on the preceding sciences. It has a subject matter of its own, which is not reducible to that of biology, etc. Yet, on the other hand, there is no essential difference between the social and the pre-social or non-social. More generally stated, between the human and the non-human. Psychology, in the language of Kant, ideology, is a part of zoology, simply. Society consists of men, and man is the subject of biology. Yet, society is a whole of which men are parts. This whole is something which escapes biology as biology. So there is a certain obscurity as to the status, as to the possibility of reducing the more complex phenomena to the more simple phenomena. We must go a step further. Sociology is not only to some extent independent of the preceding sciences, it is in a way even the science of sciences, the universal science. For all sciences are the work of the human mind as social mind, and therefore the clarification of science as such is a part, perhaps the most important part, of sociology in Kant's sense. I have spoken also of what Kant teaches regarding the practical necessity of sociology. He starts from the prevailing intellectual anarchy. There is no agreement regarding fundamentals. This is due to the dissolution of the theological spirit. And that dissolution is a work of the metaphysical or revolutionary spirit, i.e. of the philosophies of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The intellectual anarchy necessarily leads to moral anarchy, which in its turn leads to political anarchy. Man is in a transitional stage between an order, the order of the Middle Ages, and a new order, which will be the final order. And this new order can be brought about only by the consistent application of the scientific or positive spirit, by the extension of the scientific spirit to the social phenomena. In other words, science has to take over the function which theology had in the Middle Ages. The new order will be brought about by the unqualified rule of science, which means the rule of scientists. And this is he doesn't mean the rule of any mediocre scientist. He means the rule of the most outstanding, most comprehensive scientists, whom he still calls philosophers. So what Kant demands is the rule of philosophers, but of course of positive philosophers, not of metaphysicians, who are responsible in a way for the present intellectual chaos. This much to remind you of what I discussed today. Before I go on, I would like to know whether there is any point of those just made which you would like to have clarified. Yes.
Last time we referred to modern physics, modern science, as being metaphysically neutral.
Yes.
And I don't understand what that means. How can physics be considered today metaphysically neutral? It strikes me that their metaphysics, although usually undeveloped, would be more Epicurean.
Yes, but talk to any physicist or to any theorist of physics and he would deny that. He would simply say that while modern physics emerged originally from the so-called molecular philosophy, which is Epicureanism or Democritianism, this has long ceased to be the essence of physics. That is, of course, a question, but I stated only that modern science, according to the interpretation which it has of itself, is metaphysically neutral. Whether one can leave it at that is a long question. Now, let us turn, yes?
When you say that the sciences are based on preceding ones,
Yeah.
do you mean anything more than that the one accepts the results of the preceding?
At least this, but also the training acquired by the use of these methods is essential for the later sciences. You know, it is not, in other words, what Kant thinks is that a chemist, for example, must be thoroughly trained in mathematics, and the same would be true, of course, also of the biologist and of the sociologist. It is more than other in this. If this were so, then there would be the preceding sciences would be mere authorities, you know, and not truly understood. He wants more than that. That you simply say, well, my colleague in the other department has proved that, Joe has done it, and we don't have to bother about it. It's a bit more. Now let us turn then to Kant's notion of positive political philosophy, which is the same as sociology or social physics. Sociology consists of social statics and social dynamics. You see here the connection with physics. Social statics deals equally with all societies, i.e. with the conditions of existence common to all societies and the corresponding rules of harmony in regard to first the individual, second the family, and third society properly so called. The notion of society properly so called, when it has reached its entire scientific extension, tends to embrace the whole of the human species, i.e. it is no longer a national society, and principally of the white race, and go. Now, why does he make this strange, in our opinion, strange qualification or limitation of the white race? I think there is no inconsistency in that, because in Kant's time, the positive spirit was still a preserve of the Western world. which extended only later to the East and to Africa and so on. The separate treatment of the individual in social statics does not mean that the individual precedes society. Man's fundamental sociability is undeniable. There never was a state of nature in the sense of Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau. Now, regarding the individual, we must observe the preponderance of the lowest and most egoistic instincts over our social instincts. Our social instincts are weaker than our egoistic instincts. Hence, the primacy of the egoistic instincts must clearly be seen. Hence, the notion of the common good, or as he says, of the public interest, has no intelligible sense without that of the particular interest in the first place. We cannot understand the common good if we do not understand first the private good. And here Kant admires the wisdom of the biblical command, love thy neighbor like thyself. The personal instinct, as he puts it, self-love, must serve as guide to the social instinct, love of others. The strengthening of man's benevolence, which is primarily so weak, is due to the growth of his intelligence. Intelligence weakening his passions, and man achieves greater clarity about his social relations. He sees more and more that his private interest cannot be furthered without due consideration for the interest of others, for the common interest. Now, in Kant's age, people began to speak of conservative and progressive people with, this is now a very popular distinction, but it doesn't antedate the early 19th century. Now, the conservative spirit, according to Kant, is inspired above all by the purely personal instinct, by the selfish instinct, vested interests, as it came to be called later. And the spirit of improvement, the progressive spirit, is inspired by the spontaneous combination of intellectual activity with the social instinct. In other words, the intellectuals are progressive, a thesis which is now extremely popular, as you know, and here we have one early indication of it, because the intelligence strengthens the social interest, the interest in the common good, the progressiveness. Kant has abandoned the notion of the state of nature, as we have seen. He has not entirely abandoned the notion of natural right. There is indeed no necessary connection between the state of nature and the natural right. He says every individual has always the natural right, unless he has behaved anti-socially in a very pronounced way, to expect from all others the scrupulous and continuous fulfillment of the general regards due to the dignity of man. This much about the individual. Now we turn to the question of the family. According to Kant, the family is the school of sociability. And the main reason for this is that every society presupposes some inequalities. Now, the family is characterized by two fundamental inequalities, that of husband and wife, and that of parents and children. And so here we learn, so to say, the rudiments of living together by living on the basis of these fundamental inequalities. I read to you a few passages which show you how conservative Kant was compared with his present-day successors. Doubtless, the institution of marriage suffers necessarily, as all other institutions, spontaneous modifications through the gradual course of human evolution. modern marriage, as Catholicism has finally constituted it, differs radically from Roman marriage, just as Roman marriage differed from Greek marriage and both of them from Egyptian or Oriental marriage, even after the establishment of monogamy. However great one may suppose this spontaneous changes from the Oriental marriage to present-day monogamous marriage, as understood by Catholicism, they all constantly conform to the invariable fundamental spirit of the institution, which alone is here our primary subject. Now, this spirit of marriage consists always in this inevitable natural subordination of the wife towards her husband, which is always reproduced in all the changes. Now, and this is proven according to Kant, the necessity of that, not only historically but more directly by biology. Positive biology, i.e. scientific biology, tends to represent the female sex, especially in our species, because in other animals may be different, as necessarily constituted compared to the male in a sort of continuous infancy, which removes her, especially in the most important respects, from the ideal type of the race. So, in other words, science proves that women cannot reach the level of men. One cannot seriously doubt today, meaning on the basis of biology, the evident relative inferiority of the woman, who is much less capable than men, to the indispensable continuity as well as to the high intensity of mental work, either by virtue of the smaller intrinsic power of her intelligence, or because of her more lively moral and physical susceptibility, which is so opposed to every abstraction and every concentrated scientific work. And all history shows that. And especially women are wholly unfit for government. He goes much beyond the tradition, because the tradition generally said for government women can be quite good. Proof Queen Elizabeth I, Catherine, and Empress Catherine, and some others, but only the question regarding science. Good. But I read this to you more in order to show you how very conservative Kant, in spite of his progressiveness, is. Now, the third and most important subject, society strictly understood. Society consists of families, not of individuals. This is a clear return to the older view against the view of the 17th, 18th century, where society is based on a contract between the individuals and not of families. What is characteristic of society at large is the invariable reconciliation of the separation of work, the division of labor, with cooperation. Division and yet cooperation. Individuals of very great intellectual and moral differences work together without an organization or a plan, spontaneously, as we call that. The principle of society is a division of labor, which leads naturally to cooperation, or implies cooperation. And this is a crucial difference between the society and the family. The family is characterized by social affections, love, parents and children, husband, wife, and vice versa. But here, love is not of no importance in society, where solidarity is supplied by the necessary consequence of the division of labor, that they have to work together. The division of labor, and hence cooperation, also explains or justifies the multiplicity of nations. Each nation makes its contribution to the one work of mankind. The division of labor constitutes principally social solidarity. Social organization tends ever more to divide labor. The more society progresses, the greater will be the division of labor. And this takes place in accordance with the characteristics of each individual. Everyone gets that parcel of social labor for which he is best fitted. Some of you may remember the beginning of the discussion in Plato's Republic, Book 2, when he describes the division of labor and where everyone gets that job for which he is by nature fitted. But Kant is not as strict as Plato. He says the division of labor in accordance with the characteristic of each individual, regardless of whether these characteristics are natural, i.e. congenital, or due to the education received and social position. In other words, here the problem of justice arises but is not faced by Kant. Namely, whether someone who is congenitally very gifted, naturally very gifted, but doesn't receive the proper education because of his social position, whether that is fair that he remains at the bottom of the social ladder. The division of labor even produces differences between both intellectual and moral among the individuals. In other words, these are not merely the natural inequalities there, these natural inequalities are increased through the division of labor. If someone works all the time intellectually, his intellect is, as a net result, superior as the intellect of one whose intellect is never used or hardly used. Since through the division of labor, each has a very restricted sphere, say, making some part of some machine, he doesn't see clearly the relation of his private interest, his wages, or maybe even his class interest, to the public interest. So a certain atomization of society takes place. There arises therefore the need for permanent social discipline, that's to say, for government. Government is necessary because society is necessarily divisive. Social progress is due to society, but government renders a possible society. Kant comes here very close to the view, say, of Thomas Paine. The true and good thing is society, and government has only a necessary but marginal function. Yet, as we will see immediately, Kant differs very radically from Paine and his line. For the action of the government is not merely, as he puts it, material, by which he means coercive, the police, but also and above all intellectual and moral. For government stands for the spirit of the whole, whereas society is characterized by the division of labor. More precisely, the division of labor leads to the consequence that the more specialized kinds of labor place themselves spontaneously, naturally, under the continuous direction of those of greater generality. That's to say, there is a natural hierarchy. Well, the simple worker who does this kind of very limited work, there's a foreman, and so on and so on, and this hierarchy emerges without any planning by the nature of things. This fact increases, of course, the intellectual and moral inequality. That doesn't mean that the men at the bottom of the ladder are immoral, but simply means that quite a few moral potentialities are not actualized there, which are actualized on the higher level. But more intellectual and moral qualities are needed on the top than at the bottom. Every human society tends then toward a spontaneous government. This tendency is in harmony with another natural phenomenon, namely that some individuals are by nature inclined to command and others to obey or to follow. Nature is so kind, we can say, as to provide for this distinction. Yet, we have to consider that there is a need for two kinds of government. In the first place, we need a government which vouches for the preponderance of a certain system of common opinions. There is a need for the permanent existence of a speculative class. In other words, for the continuous division between theory and practice. A privileged class which enjoys the physical leisure indispensable for the culture of the intellect. And the function of this speculative class is to organize opinion and education in the largest sense of the word, i.e. not merely what's going on in schools. Its function is limited to moral influence, i.e. these intellectual rulers, well we know the scientists, are excluded from political power. The medieval separation between church and state, or rather between the power spiritual and power temporal, are a not quite perfect model for Kant. Spiritual government, the government of the scientists, we could say intellectuals, if we understand by intellectuals the man of science. Spiritual government has also the function to approve and disapprove of the public and private life of temporal government. In other words, a power of censorship which has in itself no direct political effect. The temporal government was originally of a military kind, and now it must be industrial, peaceful. The temporal government will naturally consist of the captains of industry and banking. Captain, you remind, is originally a military title, which shows a connection. At the top there would be a dictatorship of 3 bankers, not elected, but named by their predecessors, but checked by the freedom of the press and public opinion in general. And the idea being that public opinion is formed by the wisest members of society, says the man of scientists. Now, the need of a power spiritual is connected with the fact that no society is possible without religion, according to Kant. But Kant, being a positivist, can of course not have a religion with God. It must be a religion without God. Now, that which at that time might have seemed to be very paradoxical has in the meantime become a very popular notion. I've read an article, for example, by one of the present-day positivists that a scientist who is absolutely unbelieving is religious because of his dedication to science. This is not quite Kant's view. The object of worship of this religion is the human race, a religion of humanity, a religion which consists in the worship of humanity and especially of the great benefactors of the human race. Now, this is in agreement with Kant's moral teaching. Morality, according to Kant, consists in altruism, living for others, vivre pour autrui. This does not mean to exclude self-love, as we have seen, because Kant accepts the biblical command, love thy neighbor like thyself. And it is also not merely love of the present generation, but of the future ones as well. This morality is very stern. It demands severe self-control Man has no right to do what he pleases. A life of self-indulgence and mere amusement is impossible. Every citizen, high or low, must regard himself as a public functionary. Intellectual power, no less than the power of wealth, need moral control. The mind, the intellect, must be subordinated to the heart. So in other words, these scientists as rulers are supposed to be permeated by the highest morality. That is are not mere technocrats. I have switched more than once from Kant's social statics to his social dynamics, because the social dynamics is the authoritative and the fundamental part of Kant's teaching. The chief contents of Kant's new political philosophy as a whole is the law of the three stages, and this belongs to social dynamics, to the changes which society has undergone in the course of time. More generally stated, the chief teaching of Kant's political philosophy is to the effect that the whole development of the human race constitutes a progress. That's to say, an ever-increasing power of the characteristic faculties of humanity as distinguished from animality, of our most noble inclinations and our most generous sentiments. The conditions of progress are, in the first place, the continuous renovation of the agents of the social movement, that's to say, the death of the individuals. If this would not take place, rigidity would set in. And secondly, the progressive increase in numbers. Progress requires large population centers throughout history. Kant faces for a moment the possibility of overpopulation in the future, but doesn't see it as an imminent danger. The core of progress, however, is intellectual progress. History of society is dominated by the history of the human mind. And the history of the human mind, intellectual history, history of philosophy, is the key to all history. Now, history of philosophy does, of course, not mean philosophy as a field, academic field in any sense. Philosophy is this overall view which man necessarily has, whether it is theological, metaphysical, or positive. The change from military societies, feudal societies, to industrial societies is a consequence of the changes in philosophy, i.e., in Weltanschauung, in ways of thinking. The military regime had always as its indispensable political base the individual slavery of the producers, so that the warriors had the free and full development of were free for the full and free development of their characteristic activity. This institution of slavery was of crucial importance because the slaves, the producers, were the forerunners of the men of the industrial society because of the non-warlike and productive character of the work. Now, another point which makes clear, no military regime could have established itself, and especially lasted, except by being based on a sufficient theological consecration, without which the intimate subordination which it demands would never have been possible. Without this intimate correlation to the theological spirit, it is evident that the military spirit could never have fulfilled the high social destination which it had for the development of the human race. In other words, the military spirit required the theological spirit. was based on it. And therefore, the fundamental thing is the theological spirit, not the military spirit, and the whole history of the human race is intellectual history above all. Now, for the better understanding of Kant's new political philosophy, we shall consider at somewhat greater length his critique of what he calls metaphysical politics, in contradistinction to his critique of theological politics. This, for the following reason: metaphysical politics at least claims to be based on man's natural faculties alone, whereas theological politics claims to be based on divine revelation. But above all, metaphysical politics was not sociology, whereas positive political philosophy is sociology. What was the fundamental error of that political philosophy which was not sociology? In other words, what was the fundamental error of all political philosophy proper? This question is answered by Kant's criticism of metaphysical politics. Generally speaking, Kant identifies metaphysical political philosophy with that of the modern age, 16th to 18th century. But on at least one occasion, he identifies metaphysical politics with medieval thought. Metaphysical political philosophy is legalistic political philosophy. He probably thinks of the importance of the idea of natural law in both the Middle Ages and in modern times. Now, but this is not the decisive point in Kant. Metaphysical politics appeals directly to all intelligences on whatever level, i.e., no training, scientific training is required, as you must have in order to be a chemist or a biologist. The various social questions were subject of simple inspiration, and this simple inspiration you can have without any labor and even without any native gifts. In other words, metaphysical politics treated political or social subjects as if they could be treated by men not thoroughly trained in natural science as a whole. And there is, of course, an element of truth in that, because the predecessors of Kant assumed that the principles of politics, i.e. the moral principles, have a source of their own, and therefore there is no need to establish them by means of biology and so on. Even Hobbes asserted, and precisely Hobbes indeed being a metaphysical political philosophy in Kant's sense, that his political philosophy is intelligible without natural science. Now, what is common to both theological and metaphysical politics, and here we come to a deeper level, is the belief that social phenomena are, as it were, indefinitely and arbitrarily modifiable by the legislator or by providence. In other words, metaphysical politics exaggerated in an absurd manner the influence of the individual genius. It was blind to the fact that political phenomena are subject to veritable natural laws. Hence, political actions are subject to fundamental limitation. From this, Kant concludes the vanity of the search of the best government absolutely, the search characteristic of metaphysical politics. Namely, the search for the best government absolutely, i.e. without regard to any definite state of civilization, for the invariable natural laws to which Kant appeals circumscribe for each epoch the fundamental limits and the essential character of political action. Metaphysical politics treats the political and social organization in isolation. That's to say, as independent of the corresponding civilization. In the language now prevailing today, it disregards the cultural matrix of the political and social organization. The harmony between the whole and the parts of the social system is in principle spontaneous, not due to conscious action. Government is an outgrowth of society, proceeding from a spontaneous consensus. And in other words, government is not made as a metaphysical politics, according to Kant, presume. The primary action is that of society. That of government is secondary. The artificial and voluntary order made by man is a simple prolongation of the natural and involuntary order. We can state this view as follows. Society is natural. It comes into being naturally, and it subsists naturally without any human doings. Naturally, that means in accordance with natural laws. To use another distinction not used by Kant, but parallel to what he thinks, society has grown and grows. It is not made. Now, those of you who know a bit of what Kant calls metaphysical politics must be wondering, where do we find this metaphysical politics? Is this not does he not set up a phantom to find it out? Or was there such a politics once which assumed the omnipotence of quasi-omnipotence of government, of human voluntary action, and saw in it the ground of society and of government? Where do we find it? Well, you remember that Aristotle said the physis, the polis, the city, society, is by nature, i.e. it grows out of families, clans, etc. So there was nothing new in that. But where do we find this view of the quasi-omnipotence of government? Yes.
In Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, the social contract idea.
Yes. What does the social contract, at least as understood by these men, imply?
It implies that there was a time when society existed without government.
No. Perhaps Kant believes that, Locke believes that, but surely not Hobbes and Rousseau. No, we have isolated individuals. And these isolated individuals figure out that they are in a very bad situation. And on the basis of this figuring out, they consciously form society through this conscious act of the social contract. This is what and these people, when setting up their government, or their government, are of course perfectly free to set up this or that kind of government. They deliberate, should we have a monarchy or an aristocracy or a democracy, and whatever they voluntarily and consciously decide decide upon, that government will come into being. So, in other words, Kant's description of metaphysical politics is a kind of caricature, but not altogether misleading, of the teachings of the 17th, the most famous teachings of the 17th and 18th century. Aristotle's politics would not be metaphysical in this sense, although Kant does not make this sufficiently clear. But still, what Kant teaches is of course not the same as what Aristotle teaches. What's the difference between Aristotle's teaching in this point and Kant's teaching?
One difference would be that Aristotle does not distinguish the state and society.
Very good. Crucial. There are families, naturally, and there are all kinds of loose associations among citizens, and so that goes without saying. But there is no notion of society. That is of decisive importance. This concept of the society developed only in the modern age in connection with the market especially. In connection with the emergence of modern political economy. But what is it, nevertheless, that is very true. Now this is connected with something else. The political society, according to Aristotle, the polis, is concerned with the common good. And politics means a conscious concern with the common good. And the common good is above all the quality of the citizen body. Naturally also the walls of the city, public defense, etc., etc. But the highest consideration is the quality of the citizen body. Now, this is intrinsically the highest, much higher object than that of what Kant calls society, the production of goods. Now, is this not, however, admitted by Kant too? Does not Kant admit that it's absolutely necessary to be concerned with the quality of the citizen body, with education in the widest sense of the term? To some extent, Kant surely does. And this is, for Kant, the function of the spiritual as distinguished from the temporal government. To some extent, the spiritual, what he calls spiritual government, is an attempt to solve the question which Aristotle had in mind. But there is a great difference, nevertheless, between Kant and Aristotle at this point, because according to Kant, what is decisive for society is the character of common opinion. Is that common opinion, there is always there a common opinion. Is that common opinion theological or scientific? And only if it is scientific is it truly good. Now, how does this fit in with Aristotle's whole way of thinking? Let me leave it now at saying that Aristotle does not consider the possibility of common opinion of society molded by science. This is why this is so, and what this implies. That is a very broad question. I limit myself now to stating the mere fact. Now, metaphysical politics, in Kant's sense, has this character. A thinker finds out that this and this is the right political order, whether it is the absolute monarchy of Hobbes or constitutional monarchy of Locke or the direct democracy of Rousseau, doesn't make any difference. And then he says what is required for its establishment is only that the legislator or founder have a sufficient force to bring about that establishment. Against this, Kant argues that the power of the natural laws is much greater than that of any human will. It is hard to find an example of this view of political philosophy according to which the founder of a society can establish any order he pleases on society, provided he has the sufficient physical force for it. The closest approximation to it, which I know, occurs in Machiavelli's Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 18, where Machiavelli discusses the question, can a man who wants to establish a tyranny in an incorrupt society, in a society unfit for tyrannical government, succeed in doing that? And Machiavelli says very hard. He needs at least a couple of generations to corrupt the citizen body, and he won't live long enough. But if, for one reason or the other, he has sufficient force, he can bring it about in his lifetime. I believe that Machiavelli means this with a certain irony. This has no direct basis in the character of metaphysical politics itself. Another characterization of metaphysical politics, which is implied in what I said before, but I think I should mention it nevertheless, is the belief in the unlimited power of education. Just as there is an unlimited power of government, the unlimited power of education. You can make of men by education whatever you see fit. Impossible according to Kant because of the natural laws. I read to you a passage here which describes the spirit of positive politics as Kant sees it. The eminently relative spirit of positive philosophy will gradually dissipate to the evident profit of the general order this absolute disposition, as narrow as irrational, common to theological politics and metaphysical politics, which drives them unceasingly to wish to realize uniformly in all possible stages of civilizations their respective types of unchangeable governments, and which, for example, in our age has led people to conceive no other means of civilizing Tahiti except with the help of the banal importation of Protestantism and parliamentary government. So positive politics does not believe that there is a single desirable form of, or good form of government which can be established at any time in any place, but which kind of government is good for a given society depends on the character of the society in question. The spirit of positive politics is described in Kant by the term wise resignation. The resignation imposed on men by the knowledge of the natural laws which cannot be transgressed and which limit human action. True liberty can only consist in a rational submission to the preponderance, to the overwhelming power of the fundamental laws of nature, as distinguished from the arbitrary commands of rulers, where it would be foolish to resign, because these arbitrary commands could be changed. The fundamental laws of nature cannot be changed. Another point. Metaphysical politics is characterized by the preponderance of purely material considerations. But what he means by that, by the view that all political evils are due to faulty institutions and not to the social ideals and morals, i.e. to the doctrines prevailing in society. Now, in the view that the belief in propaganda, which you find frequently today, is of course also belief in institutions in Kant's sense. Insofar as propaganda can be manipulated and is based on the view that human opinions can be manipulated, whereas Kant implies this change of opinions is a matter which cannot be manipulated, but is a very, very long process, and due, especially in our age, to the expansion of the positive spirit, which requires a time of its own. In other words, the metaphysical politics believes that the temporal rulers can do what can be done in a way only by the spiritual rulers, namely the change of opinions taking place in a long generation. Metaphysical politics expects salvation from political action, and especially revolutionary action, or overstated, as Kant does it occasionally, from military action. By force you establish the right order, which you think. Metaphysical politics, we may say, is, although Kant does not use that term, unhistorical. It ascribes a chimerical fixity to essentially variable conditions. And at the same time, it despises the social or historical continuity. It trusts more in conscious actions, reform or revolution, than in the spontaneous changes. The very ends which men pursue are themselves, according to Kant, products of the historical process. I.e., these very ends are not, do not lie within the power of the individual thinker. In the real development of social evolution, the spontaneous modifications eventually produced by the gradual course of events are, generally speaking, by far superior to what the most eminent reformers could have dared to conceive in advance. A philosophy which necessarily takes history as its principal scientific base, which represents in every respect the men of all times, as well as of all places, as indispensable cooperators at the same fundamental evolution, intellectual or moral or political, and which in any case attempts always to attach the actual process to the whole of real antecedents, must certainly be judged to be much more proper today than any other philosophy to regularize the idea and the sentiment of social continuity without incurring the danger of that servile and irrational admiration of the past. In other words, change is inevitable, but this change is a matter of spontaneous rather than to be brought about by a human planning. Metaphysical politics conceive of society itself as due to human making. The individuals, or some individuals, founded society because they became convinced of the usefulness of society to the individuals. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. Which implies that man is not by nature sociable, which Kant denies. Metaphysical politics is characterized by the primacy of the individual and his rights, and especially this leads to the belief in the absolute right of free examination, or the dogma of the unlimited freedom of the conscience. It leads finally to distrust of the government, to the belief that government is by its nature the necessary enemy of society, a thought intimated by Rousseau in the Social Contract and more clearly stated by Thomas Paine. The common defect of theological and metaphysical politics: they have no awareness of historical continuity and its salutary character. Proof: the theologians condemn the modern development, and the metaphysicians condemn the Middle Ages. Kant's positive politics sees the necessity and hence the right or the function of both the medieval order and the modern development. Social conditions in every epoch are as perfect as possible. Therefore, the criticism of certain features of, say, of the Middle Ages or of modern times or of any other society are absurd. so social conditions are in every respect as perfect as possible, which doesn't mean that they can be models for another society. Let me read to you another passage. It's a correlative to it. Social conditions are in every epoch as perfect as possible, but of course not simply perfect. And therefore the possibility and the need for progress. A higher perfection is possible in the 20th century than was possible in the Middle Ages or in ancient China, whatever have you. Now, if this is so, then this leads to the consequence, and that is crucial, of the coincidence of the is and the ought. At every time the perfect is active. Only the perfect for stage A is not the perfect for stage B, C, D, etc. If this is so, there is no need, of course, for any ought. I read you a passage. Positive philosophy alone has been constantly progressing since a long series of centuries, while its antagonists have been constantly decaying. Now listen, whether this is good or bad is of little importance. The fact itself is undeniable, and this is sufficient, unquote. In other words, every wave of the future is good. We do not have to raise the question whether it is a good or a bad wave. This is one reason why already in Kant and also in the later development of positivism, the question of the ought tended to become less and less important, especially after the impact of the evolutionist doctrine on social science. Well, evolution determines what will come. We don't have to raise the question what should come, because this would be of no influence whatever. And the great reaction to that tendency in social science in the second half of the 19th century was the so-called fact-value distinction, which is so characteristic of social science today. In other words, against this so-called evolutionism, the reassertion that the evolution, and the kind of evolution, does not tell you anything as to the goodness of that trend. The question of the ought cannot be answered by the question of the is. And in this respect, that was a very sound reaction. Now, before I turn to some concluding remarks about Kant, I would like to see whether I have made these points clear regarding Kant's teaching. What is directly interesting to us as students of political philosophy is to repeat Kant's critique of pre-positivistic political philosophy, and which he calls metaphysical political philosophy. And therefore I enumerated these points. The general impression one gets from it is that this is a criticism directed above all against the political philosophy of Hobbes and Rousseau and similar thinkers. Whether to some extent by implication is of course also meant to be a criticism of Plato and Aristotle. If you think of the structure of Aristotle's politics, especially in the more practical parts of the politics books, say book 6 especially, when he always raises the question how to establish, to set up a democracy, an oligarchy, and so on. This is clearly, the emphasis is on what voluntary action of man can bring about. Needless to say that Aristotle teaches all the time that you cannot set up a democracy if the whole situation is not suitable for democracy. And the same applies, of course, to oligarchy and monarchy, whatever else you might think of. But the emphasis on what can be done by man, by political action, is much more powerful in Aristotle, even in Aristotle, than in Kant. Yes, the chief expectation is from what will take place spontaneously, as we call it, especially through the spread of the scientific spirit. Yes, Mr. Sherman.
If these stages are supposed to be in a certain historical order,
yes.
Does he explain why, for instance, Aristotle and Plato, as metaphysical philosophers, came before the Middle Ages?
No, that is I wanted to bring this up. This is one darkness. Yeah. This is not clear.
Does Kant have any speculations as to what happens after the positive age? Or is there an after the positive age? Is there a decay or...
Nothing. Silence. Characteristic of 19th century progressivism. Forgetting about the thereafter in both senses of self. Yeah. Yes.
What's the character of the natural laws that Kant is looking to? Are these specific behavioral laws?
Yes, absolutely behavioral laws, not normative laws. One of these.
Does he look merely for some general principles as the sociability of man?
No, for example, we have one example: the ineptitude of the female sex, the natural law. If you try to establish equality of the sexes, you act against the natural law, and the whole thing won't work. That's one example. But I suppose you would also say the abolition of private property, or even perhaps progressive income tax is against the natural law. That I would assume. Yeah.
How are these established?
Pardon?
How are these laws established?
By scientific methods. Kant has made it clear, however, to begin with, that in social matters, the ordinary experience of mankind, common sense, is quite trustworthy. Yeah? And this leads, of course, to, that can lead to difficulties. Yes?
The development of history in stages is inevitable. What is the justification for Kant's writing this book? Can he influence things at all, or why is he writing it?
Well, because to some extent, yes, because the transitional stage with all its miseries will last longer. And will last longer, and then if people know what is the situation, and people are in a crisis, and this would be admitted by some people, I'm sure. Now, but what is the crisis? What is the root of the crisis? Even the insight that nothing fundamental can be done about it is, of course, an intellectual solution of the practical problem, is it not? I mean, think of Vietnam today. Let us assume that someone comes to the conclusion nothing can be done, just hanging on. Yeah? In other words, the crisis will go on for the foreseeable future. That is still a practically important theoretical observation, is it not?
Well, you said earlier that Kant went so far as to say that individuals' acts were the product of the development of history stages. If that were carried to the full extent, it would mean that what everybody does was...
No, Kant, I suppose Kant would say that maybe if I don't do that, in 50 years, quite a few people will see, without my help, that this is a problem, and might adjust themselves and advise others to adjust themselves. And 200 years from now on, it wouldn't make perhaps any difference. But in the meantime, it would make a lot of difference, whether they know what's about. Yes.
Is it proper for us to ask for evidence for some of his statements like greater intelligence makes for greater sociability? Or is that just a first principle on which
No, well, he argues that out to some extent that if people are more thoughtful, look into things more closely, then they will see that their responsibility extends further than if they had not done so. There is something to that. Is it not true? I mean, if someone say, I don't care, and then you make it's not my business, and then you show him that his well-being depends on his public affairs being done properly, then he would act in a more enlightened manner, less narrowly egoistic than in the first case. It does not solve entirely the problem, because there can be a kind of egoism furthered by advanced, promoted by intelligence. I know that. Well, generally speaking, as was shown also by the last statements which I quoted, Kant is surely guilty of a very great optimism. And the strange thing is that he accuses the theologians and metaphysicians of optimism. This is, you know what optimism means originally, that this world is the best of all possible worlds. And now if someone says social conditions are in every epoch as perfect as possible, if this is not optimism, it's hard to say what it is. Yeah? Surely, so in other words, that is not a reasonable kind of discussion. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? I mean, one would have to be specified properly. Well, then I will turn and make a few critical considerations regarding Kant. I was happy to see that some of the points which I wanted to make have already been anticipated by some of you. Now, the core of Kant's teaching is the law of the three stages, as successive stages. Can one understand the history of the world, or at least the history of the West, in terms of that law? For example, if you take the development from Plato to Archimedes, and here we have in between the Stoics, who had some influence on Roman law, some social influence. This would seem to be metaphysical rather than theological, and yet it was succeeded by the clearly theological Middle Ages. This is a minor difficulty for Kant. But more important, his prediction of the victory of the positive spirit. In the foreseeable future, only the positive spirit will possess public power. He doesn't mean that there will not be individuals who think in either metaphysical or theological terms. That would be of no interest. But what about the isms which raised their ugly heads after Kant? In the 20th century especially, communism and fascism, clearly something like metaphysical politics from the point of view of Kant. But on the other hand, there is, if you think of such facts as the Supreme Court decision regarding desegregation, based on the findings of social science, this would not have been possible 100 years ago. And whereas a Supreme Court decision based on metaphysical or theological consideration is, I believe, today unthinkable. This is one of the things which shows some element of truth in what Kant meant. Yes?
I was thinking the isms that we have experienced in the 20th century, communism and fascism, lay claim to validity partially on a scientific basis.
Yeah, but Kant could say with some plausibility that the old metaphysicians also claimed to be scientific, and we are not.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Therefore, they are in fact metaphysical and not, as has often been said, of course, of communism especially, it's metaphysical and not positive. Now, to come somewhat closer to the core of his teaching, Kant's political solution, the rule of the man of science, the new power spiritual. This is based on the premise that ideas or opinions govern the world. From this it follows that the man of science will have the moral authority in the future, which the clergy possessed in the Middle Ages. But the situation, I believe, is somewhat different, because in the Middle Ages, the temporal rulers were checked not only by the power spiritual, but also by their armed subjects. What about the subjects of the captains of industry? The workers, peasants, and so on and so on, remained starved. And above all, in the medieval order, there were very great sanctions in afterlife on obedience or disobedience to the power spiritual. There is no equivalent for that in the rule of the sciences. They do not have this power over the souls of their subjects as the clergy. Kant overestimates the power of reason or of ideas. And this is very strange, because he insists on the secondary character of reason as compared with the passions, especially the selfish passions. From this point of view, one can see why Marx could have a much deeper social influence already in the 19th century than Kant, because Marx did not overestimate the power of ideas or reason. Kant is clearly anti-democratic, and his notion of government shows this very clearly. The notion of the sovereignty of the people, which emerged especially in Rousseau on the basis of, in the context of metaphysical politics, is for him an absurdity. His anti-democratic stand is based on his belief in the incompetence of the masses. And he puts his trust in the men at the top, the captains of bank and industry, controlled in a way by the men of science. The social organization tends evermore to divide labor in accordance with the characteristics of each individual, regardless of whether these characteristics are congenital or due to education and social position. Now, here the question of justice arises. Is an inferiority due to inferior education, inferior social position, something which it is necessary to admit, or can just not be changed by a social action? And you know the tremendous importance which this thought had in the time after Kant. The stabilization, the order for which Kant longed, was brought about after his time by democracy. And democracy existed at that time only in this country. And there was a great European thinker who informed Europe about this country and the likely future of Europe to be seen in America. That was de Tocqueville. Tocqueville was more foreseeing of these things, in this respect more prophetic than Kant. I do not say that a man must be write prophecies, give right prophecies in order to be wise, but if he insists on prediction of the future as a sign of wisdom, as Kant does, to be a false predictor is fatal. In other words, the stabilization was brought about not by science, but by democracy. To this one might raise this objection. is not the victory of democracy fundamentally the same as the victory of science? Dewey said that the method of the democracy is a method of intelligence, whereas the method of intelligence, I suppose, is a method of science. Ergo, there is a fundamental harmony between science and democracy. Now, this is a very long question. But that is a question is shown by the fact that within democracy the question arises, democracy or rule of experts, technocracy. And the technocracy is in a way closer to what Kant meant than the democracy. And so the technocrats would be strictly specialists, and the men whom he believed should be the rulers could not be mere specialists, that goes without saying. We must note the contrast between his positivism, his alleged sobriety based on knowledge of laws, of behavior laws, factual laws, and his amazing utopianism. Now let us look a bit more closely at this point. Science, as Kant understands it, deals only with the how, not with the why. It does not go into the question, for example, it is perfectly satisfied with the law of gravitation, Newtonian law, without going to the question of what is gravitation, the innermost nature of it. As he also puts it, the question and the where and the whither are not raised and answered by science, only the question of how. Yet these questions, not answered by science, remain. That's to say, the questions which theology and metaphysics try to answer. Even if we grant that theology and metaphysics do not supply knowledge, they take men's deepest concerns seriously and do not starve them, as science, as understood by Kant, does. What is most important to men is not dealt with by science. This experience, the ever-increasing awareness, has led to what has been called the flight from scientific reason. Science may progress indefinitely, but the more it progresses, the more it becomes aware of its essential limitations, the more science itself teaches that I cannot teach you wisdom. And what is the use of all expertise and without wisdom? Now, according to Kant, so in other words, Kant was in this respect too, to use this phrase, optimistic, that science could truly take the place and fulfills the social and human function which surely theology fulfilled, and to some extent even metaphysics. According to Kant, the fundamental error of theology and metaphysics consisted in making man the key to the understanding of everything. God's understood like in the light of man, teleological explanation of nature, as it were all nature is willing and purposeful, also in the light of nature, it means that. According to Kant, the fundamental science is mathematics, the non-teleological science. His hierarchy of the sciences implies that there is no essential difference between men and brutes. Psychology a part of zoology. Yet, is not mathematics a creation of the human mind, the social mind, and not of the brutish mind? Science is essentially of human, not brutish origin. Can science be understood as a product of the subhuman? directly or indirectly. Is then not man truly the key, if not in a very simplistic manner? Finally, regarding his religion of humanity, based on the awareness that of a religious sanction, it is clear that this religion of humanity is an ersatz religion. I suppose you know this German term, ersatz, which was coined in the First World War when Germany was blockaded and there had to be some substitute for coffee and cocoa and perhaps even bread. Ersatz means substitute, but it has this especially nasty meaning which it acquired in Germany at that time. Now, an ersatz religion is a substitute religion which, with which you could perhaps be satisfied in an extreme pinch, but which is surely not the right thing. The question would be, can men who are heirs to the biblical tradition worship something that is not eternal? Now I read to you one quite revealing passage. The actual march of our individual development from infancy to maturity, and the same is also true on a large scale. There is also such a march of the human race from infancy to maturity. Well, if we look at the individual, we know that if he lives long enough, there will also be a stage of old age, not to say senility, and eventually death. What about the old age of the human race, to say nothing of its death? Here we see, this point came up in the discussion, here we see again his quote, optimism, unquote, so strange because his major objection to theology and metaphysics is frequently expressed by the assertion that they are fundamentally optimistic. Now the reaction to this kind of optimism, Kant and others, came very soon in the second half of the 19th century, because this was exactly the heyday of, quote, pessimism, unquote, which was connected primarily with the name of Schopenhauer, but which had other famous representative, Melville in this country, and which was the counterweight to these unsupported hopes. And it is clear that what remained of Kant up to the present day is the clarity about the fundamental difference between the modern scientific approach and all earlier approaches. And then the second concern that this has an enormous social influence, at least via technology, which no one can deny. But any further assertion regarding the positive spirit which Kant makes is unsupported, has proven to be unsupported. Now, I will, with this I conclude my remarks about Kant. We will now turn to the post-Kantian transformation of positivism, and in order to come to our present problem. And the most important development, as far as we as social scientists are concerned, is the stripping of science, in particular social science, of all right to pass value judgments. This change took place a long time after Kant's death, had nothing directly to do with him. For Kant there was no question. He taught a morality, i.e. an ought, without any feeling that in doing so he ceased to be a scientist, his altruistic teaching. He spoke of progress all the time, and clearly, if you speak of progress, you presuppose, scientifically, you presuppose that you know these and these and these are values, to use this language. That was no question for Kant, but this became a question towards the end of the 19th century, and it has now, after that, become completely victorious in the Western world. The view that social science as science cannot pass any value judgment. Now, if this is so, clearly political philosophy is concerned with good or just government is an impossibility. It can be a matter of preaching, but it has no place in academic halls, because there we are dedicated to science. To this issue I would like to devote the next lectures.